Imagine 21 hours of just grueling, incredibly tense weekend negotiations that have suddenly completely collapsed.
Yeah.
A really fragile ceasefire, one that basically the entire world was holding its breath for, is now just hanging by a thread. And meanwhile, a massive United States naval blockade is moving into position to choke off, well, one of the most vital waterways on the planet.
The Strait of Hormuz, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it really sounds like the climax of some political thriller. But, it is the exact, incredibly precarious geopolitical reality we're unpacking today.
It is. And our mission for this deep dive is to figure out the actual mechanics of that reality. We are going to explore how a localized blockade in the Middle East is sending these massive shockwaves through the entire global economy.
Yeah, and why it's secretly terrifying China, too.
Right. And how it's potentially fracturing an 80-year-old Western military alliance. Now, just to be totally clear with you right up front, the materials we're diving into today, they deal with some highly charged players.
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Iranian regime. So, explicit disclaimer here. We are looking at these sources just to extract the factual claims and the analytical perspectives.
Right. We aren't taking any sides or, endorsing any of these political viewpoints.
Exactly. We are strictly here to help you understand the core arguments within your sources. So see how the engine works under the hood.
And that is the crucial lens for this deep dive, really. We're mapping out causality. Like, how does A lead to B, and why does B threaten to derail the entire global order?
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the immediate catalyst. I mean, you don't just wake up and park a fleet of warships in a major international trade route without a spark.
No, you don't. And the spark was that weekend negotiation.
The 21 hours.
Right. The U.S. spent 21 exhausting hours at the table with Iran over the weekend. And the primary, absolutely non-negotiable demand from the U.S. side was getting the Strait of Hormuz reopened for international trade.
But they failed.
They failed entirely. The negotiations just broke down.
But wait, wasn't there supposed to be like a buffer built into this? I remember reading about a 2-week cooling off period.
Yeah, exactly.
A period where both sides could, step back, maybe bring in a third-party mediator and just try to de-escalate.
That was the agreed-upon framework. And it was heavily pushed by European nations and China, too. They were essentially begging the U.S. to talk instead of shoot.
Right.
But the U.S. bypassed that entirely. President Trump was, according to the sources, reportedly impatient with the ceasefire that he felt was sort of forced onto him by other countries.
So no 2-week buffer.
No buffer.
Yeah.
Instead of using those 2 weeks to negotiate, the decision was made to escalate immediately. They initiated a naval blockade. It sent a very clear signal, basically saying the ceasefire is dead.
Okay, so the U.S. wants the strait open for trade, but their response to a failed negotiation is to blockade the strait themselves with their own warships.
I know, it seems counterintuitive.
I'm really struggling with the logic here. It's like, okay, it's like finding out someone holds the deed to your house, so you go and park a massive bulldozer at the end of their driveway.
Right.
You aren't taking the deed back, but you're making sure they can't leave their house until they hand it over. Doesn't a U.S. blockade just replace one bottleneck with another?
Well, that bulldozer analogy is actually the perfect way to look at it, because this isn't about the physical flow of ships today.
Yeah.
It's about leverage.
Leverage, right.
Iran has been using their control of the strait, or at least their ability to threaten its closure, as their ultimate bargaining chip.
Because so much oil goes through there.
Exactly. They hold the keys to a massive percentage of the world's oil supply.
Right.
And as long as they hold that card, they have zero incentive to make major concessions at the negotiating table.
They can just hold the global economy hostage anytime they don't like the terms.
Precisely. So the U.S. blockade is a calculated attempt to rip that playing card right out of Iran's hand.
Or force their hand.
Yeah. By establishing overwhelming maritime dominance, the U.S. is trying to neutralize that threat, verifiably weaken Iran's negotiating position, and, well, force them into making the concessions the U.S. actually cares about.
Which brings us to the real core of the issue. The ultimate prize here isn't just about shipping lanes or oil, it's the nuclear program.
Yeah, the root cause of this entire decades-long standoff is Iran's nuclear ambitions.
Right.
The international community, led heavily by the U.S. and Israel, views an Iranian nuclear weapon as an existential threat. Now, there's a recurring debate here in the sources.
I was going to say, people always ask about this.
Right. Why is the international community terrified of an Iranian bomb when countries like Israel already have one?
And the counter-argument.
The counter-argument driving U.S. policy is that the current Iranian regime is viewed as uniquely destabilizing and unpredictable.
And that perception, that idea of a uniquely dangerous regime is what led to a very specific, really pivotal moment back in January.
Yes, the meeting.
Benjamin Netanyahu had a conversation with Trump. And the phrasing used in the sources is just fascinating.
It is. Netanyahu reportedly told Trump, listen, Iran is weak right now. We are winning.
Wow.
He basically said, we've degraded their proxies in Lebanon and Syria, the Palestinians. Now we can strike.
Now we can strike. That assessment, that kind of whisper of perceived vulnerability is what put the U.S. into this, what the sources call escalation mode.
Exactly. It set the psychological groundwork for the massive naval buildup and the blockade we are seeing today.
But let's pause and look at the tactical reality of actually striking. Because if the ultimate goal of the blockade and this whole escalation mode is to prevent Iran from getting a bomb, we really have to look at the physical mechanics of their nuclear program.
We do, and it's complicated.
The analysis paints a picture that is, honestly, a tactical nightmare. We are talking about hundreds of kilograms of uranium enriched to 20%.
Yes, 20%.
Wait, let me stop you there, though, because to a layman like me, 20% sounds incredibly low.
Sure, it does.
If 100% is, a pure block of uranium, why is 20% the big panic number?
Because enriching uranium isn't a linear process at all. It's really about separating the highly reactive uranium-235 isotope from the stable uranium-238.
Okay.
And in natural uranium, the good stuff, the U-235, is less than 1%. So getting up to 20% requires an enormous amount of scientific labor.
Right, all those centrifuges.
Exactly. Thousands of spinning centrifuges just to sift out all that useless material. But once you hit 20%, you have essentially done 90% of the actual hard work.
Oh, wow. I had no idea.
Yeah, so racing from 20% up to 90%, which is weapons grade, is a very short, very fast sprint.
So they are sitting right on the starting line of the final sprint.
They are.
And this material, it isn't just sitting in a warehouse somewhere, right?
Oh, no, not at all. It is reportedly buried deep underground. We're talking heavily fortified bunkers carved straight into mountainside.
So they can't just drop a normal bomb on it?
No, it is specifically designed to withstand massive conventional bombardment.
And here's the detail from the sources that just blew my mind. If the U.S. wanted to stop the program militarily, they would theoretically need to send in special forces, right?
Right, to physically seize or destroy the centrifuges and the material.
But they can't, because in previous strikes, the U.S. already bombed the entrances to these exact underground facilities.
Yeah, they destroyed the access points to disrupt the operations.
The irony is just staggering. By bombing the doors shut to damage the facility, the U.S. might have inadvertently locked the nuclear material away safely.
Basically.
They sealed the vault. Now, U.S. Special Forces couldn't even get in if they wanted to.
It perfectly illustrates the severe limitations of military force in this specific scenario. You cannot bomb a nuclear program out of existence when the material is buried beneath a mountain and, well, you've collapsed the front doors.
Right.
This geographical and tactical reality is exactly why analysts like Rob DeWake look at the situation and just call it hopeless.
Let's talk about that hopelessness. Because we are presented with two deeply conflicting realities in the sources about where this 5-week-old standoff actually stands right now.
Yes, the two viewpoints.
You have the analyst view and you have the politician view.
So let's look at the politician's view first. That's represented by Ruben Brekelmans. His perspective is much more pragmatic.
Okay.
He acknowledges that the initial, maybe optimistic hopes that intense military pressure might spark some sort of democratic uprising by the Iranian people, those have completely failed to materialize.
Yeah, there's no regime change happening from within. The government is holding on.
Correct. But Brekelmans argues that the Iranian regime has still been significantly weakened militarily.
How so?
Well, their leadership has taken targeted hits. And crucially, their financial ability to fund and support regional terror groups has been diminished.
So they have less money to spread around.
Exactly. From his perspective, specific, tangible security goals are being achieved every day, even if the ultimate nuclear threat remains unresolved.
But then you look at the analyst Rob DeWeek, and he sees a completely different board.
A much darker board.
Yeah. He points out that Iran's official reaction to this massive U.S. naval blockade was to publicly call it ridiculous and laughable. That doesn't sound like a regime on its knees.
No, it sounds like a regime brimming with self-confidence.
Yeah.
The analyst argues that the U.S.'s actions are really simply hardening Iran's positions.
Making them more stubborn.
Exactly. And Most dangerously, as diplomacy fails and military options prove tactically impossible, the actual risk of Iran deciding to just make that final sprint from 20% to 90% enriched uranium is actually increasing, not decreasing.
Wow. So if a military strike is off the table because the doors are sealed and diplomacy is completely dead after that 21-hour failure, we are basically left with a war of attrition.
That's what it comes down to.
The blockade is essentially a massive test of endurance. But if Iran has longer stamina because they're a dictatorship and can ignore public opinion, the U.S. has to make the blockade hurt immediately. But how do you actually enforce a chokehold on an entire ocean?
Well, the mechanics of a modern naval blockade
Yeah.
are, frankly, highly invasive and economically devastating. The U.S. isn't just floating out there looking intimidating.
Right, they're taking action.
U.S. ships are physically stopping commercial vessels on the open sea. They are boarding them, demanding passports, checking manifests, and inspecting cargo holds to ensure absolutely no Iranian oil is slipping through.
And the sheer threat of that boarding process is what breaks the economy, right? Because of how global shipping insurance works.
That is the hidden mechanism here.
Mhm.
When the U.S. declares a blockade, major insurers like Lloyd's of London instantly classify the entire region as a high-risk war zone.
So the prices go up.
They skyrocket.
Mhm.
Insurance premiums for these massive oil tankers can jump 10 or even 20 times their normal rate overnight.
Which means shipping companies just say, no thanks. Exactly.
They refuse to enter the strait, or they reroute their ships thousands of miles entirely around the coast of Africa.
Adding weeks to the journey, burning millions of dollars in extra fuel, and just completely destroying just-in-time global supply chains. But, it gets even more complicated when you factor in the threat of seizure.
Right, because if a ship does brave the waters, and the U.S. boards it and finds Iranian oil destined for a third-party country, they seize it.
And suddenly, the U.S. isn't just punishing Iran. They are directly damaging the economic interests of whatever neutral country that oil was destined for.
That's a huge problem.
The analysis predicts that those third-party countries won't direct their anger at Iran. They will be furious with the United States for seizing their property.
Wow.
Yeah, the most likely reaction is that these nations will actually develop sympathy for Iran and hostility toward the U.S.
That is a massive diplomatic backfire. You are dragging neutral countries into the conflict and actively weakening your own global coalition.
Which brings us to the biggest third-party player on the board, China. There is a very striking visual mention in the sources. It's a cover of The Economist magazine.
Oh, right, the magazine cover.
Yeah, it shows President Trump screaming, and behind him, China's President Xi Jinping is just smiling calmly.
A great image.
Right. The headline implies China is just following the old proverb, never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake.
It's a very compelling narrative. The underlying assumption is that China is just sitting back, rubbing its hands together, thrilled to watch the U.S. drain its resources and geopolitical capital in some messy Middle Eastern conflict.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because the sources say that magazine cover is completely wrong.
It is.
Why is China actually panicking behind the scenes?
It comes down to their hyper-reliance on global stability. I mean, publicly, if you read Chinese English-language media, it is wall-to-wall, hardcore criticism of the U.S. and Israel.
Sure, playing to the crowd.
But consider how selective that outrage is. When Russia invaded Ukraine, China was remarkably quiet about international law and territorial sovereignty. They tend to shout only when their own vital economic interests are directly threatened.
And their vital interests run straight through the waterway the U.S. is currently blockading.
The numbers are staggering, frankly.
Yeah.
China's economy has been slowing down significantly for years. They are desperately trying to keep their export levels high to prevent massive domestic unemployment and internal unrest. But to manufacture those exports, they need energy. China gets 50% of its oil from the Gulf region and a full 13% directly from Iran.
Wait, half their oil? Half their oil flows through a choke point that is currently seeing insurance premiums skyrocket and U.S. warships boarding tankers.
Yes. China desperately needs the Strait of Hormuz open. They need oil prices low and the global economy stable.
So a blockade is their worst nightmare.
Exactly. If this blockade causes a global economic recession, demand for Chinese exports drops. Factories slow down, economic growth stalls, and their domestic unemployment rises to really dangerous levels.
Not to mention the money they've spent there.
Right. Plus, they have invested heavily in infrastructure and diplomatic ties with the current Iranian regime.
It is a massive contradiction.
Right.
China's goals, a stable global economy, an open strait, keeping the Iranian regime in power are completely at odds with the U.S. goals, which are maximizing economic pressure, blockading the strait, and weakening the regime.
Yeah.
China has to figure out how to navigate a conflict that threatens the absolute core of their economic stability without getting pulled into a direct military confrontation.
And, that economic anxiety isn't just isolated to Beijing. The spikes in energy prices and the supply chain chaos, they are landing right on kitchen tables across Europe.
And this is where the ripple effect starts actually tearing at the fabric of Western alliances. The analysis highlights a really telling moment from the UK. Prime Minister Keir Starmer gave an interview where he was openly venting his frustration about the economic hit.
Yes.
He stated he is fed up with the fact that British families and businesses are watching their energy bills just wildly fluctuate, and he blamed it on, and this is a direct quote regarding his framing, the actions of Putin or Trump.
He grouped the actions of the Russian president and the U.S. president in the exact same breath when discussing threats to European stability.
That is a staggering rhetorical shift, to put your closest historical ally in the exact same bucket as an active geopolitical adversary.
It is a massive shift. Now, the politician in the analysis, Breckelmans, strongly pushes back on this framing.
What does he say?
He argues it is incredibly dangerous and intellectually unfair to equate Putin, who he defines as an unprovoked aggressor bombing civilian targets in Ukraine daily, with Trump.
Right, because Trump represents an ally. Exactly. Trump represents an 80-year NATO ally actively fighting a regime that sponsors global terror. Breckelmans argues that conflating the two is a fundamental failure to distinguish between an enemy and an ally.
But the analyst, De Weg, takes Starmer's quote not just as a slip of the tongue, but as a symptom of a terminal disease. And this is the absolute bombshell assessment of this entire deep dive.
Yeah.
He claims that NATO is dying.
He states it unequivocally.
Yeah.
And he points to two converging factors. First, the post-Brexit reality means the UK is already somewhat isolated from the broader European Union bloc.
Right.
Second, the perception of Trump's unpredictable transactional behavior is actively pushing traditional allies away. He argues that the vaunted special relationship between the UK and the US is currently worth zero.
Zero. That is chilling. And we are seeing the behavioral shifts to back it up in the sources.
Yeah.
The UK is scrambling. Starmer is flying to the Gulf to secure independent energy alliances.
Yeah. And there is urgent talk of the UK bypassing their own parliamentary procedures to strike new, rapid cooperative defense and trade deals with the European Union.
They are acting exactly like a country that suddenly realizes its primary bodyguard just walked off the job.
Right. The perceived unreliability of the U.S. is driving the British right back into the arms of the EU. And the Gulf states are experiencing the exact same realization. They're recognizing they have to hedge their bets and build security frameworks that don't rely entirely on an American administration they view as totally unpredictable.
It's a huge realignment.
But if the analyst is right, and NATO is actually dying, what happens next? I mean, what is Plan B for an entire continent that has relied on the U.S. nuclear umbrella and military presence since World War II?
The analysis does outline this Plan B, and the timeline is what is truly shocking. De Wick argues that Europe could theoretically map out exactly how to operate a unified defense alliance without the United States within 14 days.
Wait, really? 14 days?
Yeah.
They could replace the strategic framework of an 80-year alliance in 2 weeks.
Well, to map it out on paper, yes. The military planners have already run the simulations. They know exactly which logistical, intelligence, and command functions the U.S. currently provides that Europe would need to absorb and replace.
Okay, so they have the blueprint.
Right. It would take about a year to get the actual organizational and bureaucratic framework running.
But mapping out a command structure on paper is vastly different from physically defending a continent against an actual invasion.
And that is the fatal catch. The vulnerability isn't in high-tech infrastructure like satellite capacity or even the nuclear deterrence held by France and the UK. The fatal gap is in physical, heavy machinery.
Weapons.
Yes. Due to the peace dividend following the end of the Cold War, Europe largely disarmed. They outsourced their heavy defense to the U.S. and focused their budgets on social safety nets and high-tech economies.
So they don't have the gear.
They closed the tank factories, they shuttered the missile assembly lines. Today, Europe severely lacks the sheer volume of heavy weapon systems and Patriot missile defense batteries required for a sustained conflict.
And you can't just 3D print a Patriot missile on a 14-day timeline.
Not even close. You can draft a new defense treaty in 2 weeks. But rebuilding a massive defense industrial base, Sourcing the raw materials, training the skilled labor, building the assembly lines, and actually manufacturing enough Patriot missiles to defend European airspace.
That takes a long time.
It takes years, decades even. If NATO dies today, Europe has a bureaucratic plan for tomorrow, but they won't have the physical missiles to defend themselves for half a decade.
Let's pull all of this together because the sheer scale of the domino effect here is incredible. We started with a failed 21-hour negotiation over a weekend,
Yeah,
a diplomatic breakdown that led directly to a massive U.S. naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz.
a blockade utilizing economic mechanisms like skyrocketing insurance premiums to strip away Iran's leverage over a nuclear program. A program that, ironically, might be safely locked away inside the very mountain bunkers the U.S. previously bombed shut.
And that local tactical standoff is now threatening the entire global oil supply, which is secretly terrifying a fragile, export-driven Chinese economy that desperately needs that energy to keep its factories running and its population employed.
Right, while the resulting global economic anxiety and the spikes in energy prices are frustrating European leaders so deeply that they are publicly equating U.S. actions with Russian aggression.
Which culminates in the very real, very sobering possibility that European nations are actively planning for a world without NATO, drafting a 14-day Plan B to survive without American defense, while staring down a 5-year gap in their ability to actually manufacture the weapons they need.
Is a profound illustration of how deeply interconnected our global systems are. I mean, a blocked strait in the Middle East echoes all the way to a frantic parliamentary maneuver in London and factory floors in Beijing.
It really is. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to ponder as you digest all of these connecting pieces. We often look at global alliances like NATO or international trade routes like the Strait of Hormuz as permanent fixtures of the modern world. They feel like the concrete foundations of our reality. But if a single geopolitical choke point and just a few days of failed diplomacy can force a continent to seriously map out the end of an 80-year-old military alliance in just 14 days, it makes you wonder, what other unbreakable global structures are just one crisis away from completely collapsing?
A really vital question to ask in an increasingly fragile world.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into your sources. We hope pulling apart these mechanisms gave you a clearer view of the board. Keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time.